Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yavar Hameed. I'm a human rights lawyer based in Ottawa, where I have, for more than 2 decades, represented clients in cases seeking to hold our government to account. I'm joined today by my clients, Tamer, who will be joining us by a video link, Hani and Farah, whose family members have been killed, injured, or displaced by Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip over the last 6 weeks. Earlier today, my law firm provided notice to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and others of an intention to prosecute Canadian officials for aiding, abetting in crimes that have been committed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel's military offensive on Gaza and its civilian population has killed more than 14,000 Palestinians, 10,000 of whom are women and children. As a result of the 6-week bombing campaign, more than 35,000 Palestinian civilians have been injured and 1.4 million people have been displaced. These acts, among others, constitute grave breaches of international law, resulting in condemnation from the United Nations, member states of the international community, and millions of people the world over. The Canadian government has acknowledged that Israel must comply with international law, but such acknowledgements are disconnected from facts on the ground. Canada has continued to offer support to Israel despite international human rights organizations and officials within the United Nations presenting evidence of war crimes. There is concern that Canada has provided Israel with financial assistance and has even dispatched its elite Joint Task Force to support it. The Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court and is part of Canadian domestic law in the War Crimes Act, indicates that any Canadian citizen who conspires or attempts to commit or is an accessory after the fact in relation to crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes committed outside of Canada is guilty of an indictable offense. Where there is evidence of participation or complicity in such crimes, my clients intend to prosecute. The notion of intention to prosecute sets out several fundamental and categorical demands of the Canadian government, including, number one, to issue a public statement condemning Israeli breaches of international law, including breaches that amount to war crimes. Secondly, to insist that Israel complies unequivocally with its obligations under international humanitarian law and international criminal law. And thirdly, to call for an immediate ceasefire. Behind these crimes are Canadian victims with tragic stories, and adding to their tragic stories is a government that has failed them. I'm now going to invite Tamer by video link to share his experience and that of his family.
Please turn on your mic.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we are.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Greetings. I'm Tamer Jarada, a Canadian residing with my family in Calgary, Alberta. I hold a PhD in computer science, and I'm currently working as a senior research associate in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. My own experiences vividly portray the heart-wrenching reality in the Gaza Strip. On October 9th, 19 members of my family, including parents, sisters, nephews, and my uncle's family, narrowly escaped death when their homes were bombed. Subsequently, they sought refuge in my own 3-bedroom apartment. On the morning of October 25th, while preparing my kids for school, I learned via telegram that an Israeli airstrike had wiped out the entire block where my family had sought refuge. Tragically, 16 members of my family, my father, Nasser, my mother Nema, my sisters Nisreen and Haneen, my uncle Harbi, my aunt Fawziya, my cousins Muhammad and Rabah, and their wives Roba and Hala, my young nephews Abdullah, Nasser, Kareem, and Harbi, and my young nieces Maymana and Habiba were all killed. It took 7 days for family and friends to dig and pull dead bodies out of the rubble. Were there with their bare hands because there were no tools or equipment. Additionally, the residence of my pregnant sister, my only surviving family, sustained partial damage from bombing. This forced them to seek shelter at their neighbor's place, which had been bombed 3 days ago, compelling my sister, her husband, and 3 young children to seek refuge under the stairs of their bombed house during these cold days. I was able to connect with my sister yesterday, and she was begging me to help her. I'm helpless. I can't help her. The ongoing attacks on the Gaza Strip have eliminated any semblance of a safe haven, causing deep concern for all the well-being of my sister's family, my wife's family, and all residents of the Gaza Strip. The gravity of the situation has left both my wife, Wafa, and myself unable to focus on daily activities, as the constant worry for our family's safety weighs heavily on our minds. We are deeply pained and frustrated by the unfolding events in the Gaza Strip, reaching a point where we anxiously wait, fearful of receiving more news about our families and loved ones. The horror of the situation and the widespread destruction in the Gaza Strip serve as a painful reminder of the urgent need for a ceasefire and immediate humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of those affected. A peaceful resolution is crucial to address the long-standing ethnic cleansing endured by Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamer. We'll now hear from Hani.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hani al-Batniji. On September 20th, I visited my family in Gaza. On October 7th, I was unable to return home to Canada because of the hostilities between Israel and Hamas. My family and I took cover as the bombing and explosion nearly by family's house. We were forced to evacuate quickly. With my nephew, his wife, and their 4 children, we sheltered at my sister's house. We were 70 people in one house. The violence had us moving from house to house and city to city to avoid the bombs as they got louder. From Shujaiya to Al-Nasr to Khan Yunis to Deir al-Balah and finally to Rafah. Each house we stayed at for a few days until the bombing intensified. There was constant fear of being the next victim, as scary, constantly worried I might not wake up next day. I received the news November 22nd that my niece she evacuated from the first place with me, and her 2 children were killed by an Israeli bombs, and my sister was injured. 3 days before, 37 members of my family, my extended family, half of them children, were killed by the bombers. As of today, we have 71 members of my family have been killed. Too many of them were barely taller than my waist. I made fantastic calls to my family in Canada, asking for help. My daughter called Canadian officials over and over again, seeking assistance to evacuate Canadians. My experience with Canada officials was not good. There was very little information provided and even less help instead. There were many public statements that Canada supported Israelis' attacks while my family and I were still in harm's way. Some are no longer in harm's way. May they rest in peace. Finally, after many days at the Rafah crossing, my name was called. I felt like I'm born again. And I won the lottery of life. I was one of the lucky ones to leave for safety to Cairo. I left behind many who are not as lucky like I am. I left behind the smell of death, the horrifying sounds of explosion, and the sight of dogs eating the flesh of the dead bodies. My last memory before leaving the Rafah crossing was the destruction of buildings 200 meters away. It was bombed with 80 people trapped beneath the rubble. The wave from the explosion made my ears bleeding. Despite the death and destruction, the people of Gaza constantly rushed to help each other and to share what little food and homes they have left. I cannot help them, but the least I can do is to ask my government to call for ceasefire. The people of Gaza deserve to be lucky like me, too. I am still working to get my sister and her husband out. Their children are here with me. I pray every day that they will see each other again. Thank you.
We'll now hear from Farah.
For 46 days, the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs worth of explosives have been dropped on 2 million civilians, including my family, with nowhere to go. Their only apparent crimes come down to the semantics of where they were born. To put it in perspective, the Gaza Strip is nearly the size of Gatineau Park. Hospitals, UN facilities, mosques, and churches, they're all targets. No place is safe. There is no sanctuary for them or anyone in Gaza. Basic means of survival have become impossibly inaccessible. My baby cousins have to be consoled with scraps of food and little to no drinking water as they are repeatedly displaced from home to crammed home, shelter to overflowing shelter, with no reprieve from the constant bombardment. Weeks go by and we don't know if our family members are alive. We have to scour the horrific images emerging from Gaza, hoping to catch a glimpse of their familiar faces. When we do manage to hear from them, we hear their voices numb with grief as they recount the names of our friends and relatives that they've had to bury with no time to mourn because this nightmare hasn't stopped. The sounds of bombs echo to no end in the background of every phone call that manages to go through, and when the phone line abruptly disconnects, our hearts stop with them. If we're lucky enough to say goodbye, we pray and hope this won't be the last time we hear from them. 24 days ago, on October 30th, I stood here in this very room. I shared my story, spoke of my family, and I made a very simple demand. Calling for a ceasefire is the very bare minimum that Canada can do. 46 days later, when will your sentiments of grave concern turn to action? Hiding behind the smoke and mirrors of diplomacy will not absolve you of your complicity as you discredit yourself in our eyes. When referring to the Palestinian refugees violently displaced and dispossessed from their ancestral homeland 75 years ago, the first Israeli prime minister said that the old will die and the young will forget. Today, we know that despite the violent history of displacement on this very land, our young and old have only proven otherwise. Remembrance is embroidered in the very fabric of our being, and our remembrance only fuels our commitment to the truth from Turtle Island to Palestine. You may not care to learn the names of my family and the countless civilians killed simply because they are Palestinian, but your names will be immortalized as the signatories of their violent demise, and history will not be kind to you.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Hani. Thank you, Tamer. If there are any questions, vous avez des questions?
Tom Perry with CBC. Can you explain how this would, I guess, force the government's hand into calling for a ceasefire?
Right. So the notice of prosecution does two things. It lays out the context of international crimes against humanity as committed by Israel. The hope is, or the intention is, the gravity of those concerns, coupled with the prospect that Canada, in some measure, has been, or rather, I should say, individual Canadian officials may have encouraged or been complicit in that process, will cause the government to rethink its approach. Part of that, and it's sort of not a direct response to that, but in order to immediately respond to the gravity of these international crimes, the ceasefire is the first step. It's certainly not the resolution, but it's the first step for preventing future harm.
Could a court order the government to call for a ceasefire? I just don't understand that point.
And so the remedy doesn't flow specifically from what we're doing in the notice of prosecution. So the demands or the requests, and our notice of prosecution sets out several demands, are basically the measures that must be done to minimize further harm. And so I guess as in any prosecution or any indication by a court or other tribunal of unlawful conduct, it sends a message to the state and those responsible that those actions must stop. And as part of that, I guess the notion of complicity is that not calling for a ceasefire, not taking that step, is facilitating that harm from taking place.
And is the Canadian call for a ceasefire anything more than symbolic? I just don't know how much impact it would have if Canada were to come out and say, we call for a ceasefire. Really, realistically, what impact would that have?
It's incredibly important in terms of, for one, and we have to understand this notice being really a plea for the families to reach out to their government. They want accountability. They want some kind of response. And so in the scheme of things, in the scheme of like any kind of legal measure, the most impactful or significant measure that our government could possibly do is to make that call. Certainly, our government can't control what another state does, but it does have, and this is part of the context leading up to this, it does have a very close relationship with Israel. And so that context is important. I think it also animates this notice of prosecution in the sense that that close relationship also means, support in a number of different ways. And my clients are concerned, has that or could that lead to complicity in these crimes?
One last thing.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Okay. I forget, actually. Go ahead.
Okay, yes, sorry, just... so this is, there's, I guess, in what's the notice that's been served, there's like a list of what is perceived as like the Israeli war crimes.
Yes.
And then does that also detail how it's believed that these politicians are complicit or at least, I guess, liable for these things? Is it just because they haven't called for a ceasefire, or are there other actions or statements they've made that would make them liable or complicit?
So at this stage, the notice of prosecution puts the government on notice that, in addition to not calling for a ceasefire, a number of steps, some which we know, some which we may not know of, have facilitated have encouraged the actions of Israel. So, in short, not calling for a ceasefire, may be sort of a symptom of a larger problem, in the sense that we have here, and you've heard some of the testimony of families that have been injured, displaced, and killed. The concern here is that has anything that's been done by Canada contributed to that? And so we don't know definitively what has or hasn't been done, but we believe, and the purpose of this notice of prosecution is that the evidence that we do have is so important, so compelling. It raises the seriousness of bringing this to the attention of key government officials, including the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to look at that question. And so a second part of this will be both looking at the evidence of harm, and also looking at the action of Canadian officials. So we don't, for example, have the information on those specific acts, but we certainly do have a whole context of how Canada's actions and inactions are encouraging or perhaps facilitating Israel to take these actions.
And just this is sort of just a clarification. I think I have you. It was served to the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs, and I think Defense. Did you say?
No. So I'll indicate. So it's the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice, the Commissioner of the RCMP, and the Director of Public Prosecution. So those 5 individuals.
And it's specific to those 5, or it could be opened up to basically any Canadian politician in.
Just to clarify, the notice, and I can go over those names again, and you can certainly see it on the notice. Those key officials are responsible, would be responsible for, certainly responding to, taking action in respect of these grave concerns. So it actually is not an indictment against those officials. Those officials are the ones who should take note, should respond, should react. And so the larger question as to who is responsible, that is something to be explored. And we'll need to do that as we try to assess what is sort of the mechanisms of this complicity.
The government has said in the past, I don't know if they're sure what their position is right now, is that they don't want to call for a ceasefire because doing so, a ceasefire, would allow Hamas to regroup, rearm, and launch further attacks. Do you see that as a legitimate argument?
No. The importance of calling for a ceasefire, and sort of in answer to your previous question, it's basically a condition precedent to anything that has to happen to comply with international law. So, for example, if the bombardment, as the position that we maintain, the United Nations and the international community says, is a war crime, crime against humanity, other kinds of grave violations of international law, the response to that is that must cease. Moving forward, the political dynamics of how that'll work, that has to be worked out by the states themselves. But in order to do that, in our view, and I think this is what international law holds, the state, and this is Israel in this case, must respect international law. So you can't move forward without that respect for international law.
What about Hamas? Do you have any expectation that they would abide by a ceasefire? Given the events of October 7th, do you have any belief that they would abide by a ceasefire? And are you calling on them to do that?
So this notice is really to our Canadian government. So the mechanism here, and I can't really speak for Hamas what they will or won't do, but we're calling on our government to do something. So what we're asking for is through the mechanism where we're hoping there'll be accountability. We have brought the notice to 5 key representatives, and we're hoping they'll take it very seriously. We're taking it very seriously, and despite the fact that we don't have all the evidence at this point to bring this forward, certainly the government is privy to its relationships, what it has done and what it hasn't done. And so as a first step, we bring this notice, and we hope they'll take it seriously. But certainly from our perspective, as we discover the evidence, where the evidence leads us, we intend to prosecute where there's evidence of complicity.
But in terms of the end state that you're trying to achieve, you want to end the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, but you also want Hamas rockets to stop landing in Israel. Is that fair to say?
We want a peaceful resolution, and that means no one to be bombarded. Yes.
We'll now take questions on Zoom. If you have a question, please use hand raise function. Joshua, one question, one follow-up.
Hi, good afternoon. The International Center for Justice for Palestinians introduced a similar notice of prosecution about a week ago. Is your notice today coordinated with the ICJP, or is it entirely separate?
Thanks for the question. I can't really speak to that. This is a separate notice that's being brought. Really, it's being brought on the kinds of concerns that are raised by my clients, the individuals who you've heard from today. That's sort of the source of it. And we're in the process of collecting more testimonies and more evidence.
And it's my understanding that you can't introduce private prosecution to the International Criminal Court. You have to get a third-party signatory of the Rome Statute to request the ICC prosecutor to investigate possible alleged war crimes. Are you planning to move forward along that path, or is this notice of intention to prosecute just a symbolic move to compel the government to call for a ceasefire? Right.
So we, as I've indicated before, we intend to go where the evidence leads in terms of complicity. We think that these grave breaches are serious. We've put the government on notice of that. Certainly, to the extent that we brought it here in Canada, my role and purview as a lawyer practicing domestic law is in Canada. We intend to pursue the evidence in this forum. We don't rule out other international possibilities, and so we're definitely looking at other angles as well. But to the extent that there is evidence, as I say, of complicity, we intend to pursue that and prosecute that.
Kristen, your turn.
Hi, Mr. Hameed. It's Kristen Schmitz from Law 360 Canada.
Hello.
Turn on your mic, Kristen, please.
Hey. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, sorry. I haven't seen your notice to prosecute, so I'm completely unclear on where the jurisdiction is, what court. So under what jurisdiction are you looking to prosecute? Is it Canadian law? In what court? And do you need permission from the Attorney General if it's a private prosecution to do that? Can you explain procedurally what you're doing?
Certainly. And so the first answer to your question is that the notice, so to speak, is a letter. It is not a proceeding. So
Okay.
an action, an application, or an indictment has not been filed in any court. At this stage, and in part sort of animated by our concerns about the gravity of these crimes, we wanted to and we needed to bring these concerns to the government's attention. This also enables us to collect evidence, to move ahead with a prosecution. Certainly, from our perspective, moving ahead in Canada within this jurisdiction under the Rome Statute, which allows for the consideration of crimes committed abroad through the War Crimes Act. There's jurisdiction here to move forward. In answer to your question as to whether we need permission from the Attorney General or what that dynamic will be, that will be a stage that we'll deal with, as the procedure unfolds. But that is certainly a variable in terms of how the Attorney General will respond to such a prosecution.
The prosecution would be under what? Is it a civil statute we're talking about? Is it criminal code? Precisely what are you going to prosecute under potentially?
So potentially it can be both or either. So there's civil liability in the sense of in the federal courts there could be declaratory relief, there could be injunctive relief under the criminal code, because we're talking about crimes, we're talking about criminal acts. There's also that jurisdiction as well.
So you might seek a civil action like mandamus to force the government to call for a ceasefire?
In terms of where that might lead, any remedy is certainly on the table. Getting into those realms of foreign affairs and the prerogative of the state in those regards, I can't really pronounce on those issues. But mandatory and other forms of relief, those are certainly available through the federal courts.
We'll come back to the floor for more questions.
Just so I'm clear, so you're not sure what court you're going to file this in or when this is going to happen? Is that correct?
Right now, we don't have a specific timeline for how this is moving ahead, and part of that is, and it's sort of, I guess, distinct from a case where we would have lined up all the evidence and we're bringing it, we're ready to go tomorrow. And one of the reasons for that is the unfolding crisis. And so we kind of, in a sense, it's early in the process, but we thought it's so serious to announce our notice, despite the fact that it's actually not a proceeding in any specific court. But as I indicated before, there's a number of options and a number of directions in which this can go.
So concretely, you've sent a letter to the Prime Minister and others
Yes.
saying that you are prepared to do this. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So you haven't launched any legal proceedings at this point? You haven't even decided what court that might happen in?
We haven't. It's sort of open, and it's also dependent on as we've done this announcement, and there was mention of another announcement that happened earlier. People are coming forward. They're sharing their testimonies. They're sharing their evidence. So we're learning more about this, and in the coming days we will, unfortunately, we'll probably be hearing more of those stories, and so based on that, we'll take our cue.
I don't want to, but it just seems that this is so early in the process that, I mean, the war could be over by the time you get to the end of your process. I just don't know. This seems more symbolic to me. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So I guess there's two aspects to it, and I think it's important for I guess the deterrent effect. We don't know whether it's a ceasefire or a lasting peace or what will happen. To find out accountability for the kinds of things that we just heard today. So those issues, for lack of a better term, they can't be rendered moot. They're things that happened. And so there needs to be accountability for that. When that will happen or how that will happen, I'm certain that those families that are aggrieved will want some form of justice, and that's we're again taking our cue from them.
Any final word you would like to tell? We're good?
Yes, thank you.
This concludes this press conference.